Okay, why don't we get started? If you remember, last week we did Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism. So we started heading towards the Eastern religions at the end with Hinduism. We're going to pick up with Buddhism, which is going to have a lot in common. Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shintoism, or excuse me, and Taoism, the first three that we're going to talk about, have a lot in common with Hinduism, and that'll be clear as we go. Of course, these are all Eastern religions. So Buddhism, what is Buddhism? It is a religion that originated in India. It began in India, although today it's not associated with India very much. We're talking about the 6th to 4th century BC is the development of this religion. It is now throughout all Southeast Asia and really is not in India anymore. It's a very small, has a small presence in India today, but originally it was from India. There are two primary branches of Buddhism, and their goals are what set them apart in many ways. So there's Theravada and Mahayana, and again, I butcher pronunciations, so life goes on. The goal of Theravada Buddhism is nirvana. You've probably heard that term, people talking about nirvana. They're seeking nirvana, which means ending the reincarnation. All right, that's the goal of that branch of Buddhism, is to stop reincarnating. In other words, to cease to exist. That's actually the goal. All right. Whereas Mahayana Buddhism says that we want to attain Buddhahood. We want to attain enlightenment. We'll talk about that, of course, in a minute. And then help other people, but you continue. So one branch of Buddhism says the goal is to end it all. The other says is that no, it's just to be enlightened and then continue on as an enlightened person. And so we'll look at that. But I mean, that's similar. It's related, but it's a little bit different. So the first guy that is known as Buddha, his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and it's historically speaking, we can't verify too many things about his life, and like exactly where he was born or exactly when he lived. But he probably lived in that mountainous region between India and Nepal. And he said, you know what, this suffering stuff is a mess. It's innate to humanity. In other words, every human suffers. Which of course Christianity would agree, right? The world is full of suffering. Everybody dies, everybody has problems. That's no difference there. But he saw that in view of the idea of reincarnation, that this is going to keep happening again and again and again. And he said, we just can't, something's got to give. We can't just keep suffering life after life after life. It's not right. And so he said, how are we going to end it? All right, how do we end the repeated suffering of rebirth and reincarnation? And so he started with studying meditation. The Hindu Vedics, those ideas were already out there about meditating, and he looked into it and studied meditating, but realized that didn't end suffering. You can't end a person's suffering by meditating, by contemplating. Life still's hard, right? And so he turned to asceticism, which is self-denial, right? Maybe if you don't become attached to things in this world, you don't get involved, maybe you just can get away from suffering there. But that didn't work either, and so he went back to meditation. And of course, the story goes that he sat under a tree for a long time, thinking about things, contemplating, meditating, trying to figure it all out, and at some point along the way, he figured out what is called the middle way, and we'll define that in a minute, which he said, this is the path ending suffering. And so he founded a monastic order of fellow people to meditate on the things that he had discovered, and by the end of his death, he had a movement going. All right, which would grow and develop and go from there. So his primary contribution, of course, is the understanding, all right, of what that meditation is to achieve and how to do it and all that kind of stuff. So what do they say about God? What do they say about human souls? The Buddhists pray to Buddha, but they don't think that Buddha is a God. All right, they recognize he's just a man like us. He was an enlightened man, which made him a Buddha, but he's not a supreme being. All right, there is no real concern for supreme beings in Buddhism. They don't think that anything is fixed or permanent. Not God, not the human soul. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is unchangeable. So there's no such thing as a self in anything. There's no such thing as an essence. In other words, nothing is really real in the sense that it has eternal or permanent existence, which is an interesting take. So they don't worry about God. All right, the Buddhists don't sit around talking about God and what's God like and what's the nature of God and they don't. It's just not part of the conversation. If you're a Buddhist, you can believe in God if you want, or you can say, who knows, who knows these things, and you can be an agnostic, that's fine. You can be an atheist as a Buddhist. It's not really part of the question. The true goal, the purpose, the key is ending suffering. And since the Buddhist doesn't think that God is part, if there is or isn't a God, part of ending our suffering, they're not going to be concerned with God. All right? So it's a very different, obvious viewpoint than Christians, Muslims, Jews, and many Hindus, right? The idea that God's not really part of the equation. But they do, of course, have the same ideas of dharma, karma, and reincarnation with the Hindus and the Jains and the Sikhs that we talked about last week. They believe in dharma, that everything has a purpose. People, plants, everything has a purpose. They believe in karma, that everything is action and reaction, and certainly in reincarnation. If they didn't believe in reincarnation, he wouldn't have been sitting around trying to think how to end it and get out of it, right? So rebirth depends on what you did in your life, which is your karma, of course, same as the Hindu. And one unique little twist on that is that if you have extra good karma, you can kind of share it with some family, with your ancestors, with your descendants, whatever, which is not half bad, I suppose. I don't know who thinks they've got extra. Most people would probably be worried that they've got enough of their own. And they said that your rebirth is going to be on one of 6 levels, which is not all that different than the caste system, right? The caste system had different levels based upon what you did in the last life, and you have the same sort of thing going on here. But with Buddhism, intent is brought into it. Your attitudes, your intentions matter as well as your actions, which is a little much more strict, right? Which actually, again, shares some similarity to what Jesus says in the Gospels, right? When, he said, you're worried about that, but I tell you that, that it's not just the committing of adultery, it's the wanting to commit that is a sin as well. And so the Buddhist would agree with that and said, yes, your intentions matter as well as your actions. And so the original Buddha came up with the 4 noble truths. The 4, these are the presuppositions. These are the fundamental beliefs of Buddhism on which the other things are built. The first one is that we cling and crave to things that are impermanent, and so therefore are unsatisfactory. Life would be, of course, one of those, but in terms of hunger and pain and all of the things that we experience in life, they're because nothing is permanent, and we're trying to hold on to things, and that's why we experience pain. All right? And that experience of pain leads to our endless cycle of rebirth. I'm not sure where the logical thought is on that, but this is not like a Western philosophical logic kind of thing, all right? You're not applying Aristotelian logic to this. It doesn't work that way. So you've got pain, which leads to rebirth, and then the attainment of nirvana is stopping that craving. In other words, the ultimate problem is that we cling and crave, that we want things that we can't have or can't keep. All right, and what we ultimately need to do then is figure out how to let those things go. All right, and if you are familiar, as I am, with the lore of George Lucas in the Star Wars universe, you could almost hear Yoda explaining this stuff, right? That's what he's talking about. Attachment leads to, and then he explains all that stuff to young Anakin, that because he loves and isn't willing to let go, that's why he's got all of this anxiety and all this fear, and it leads him to the dark side. Very, very Buddhist ideas. And then, of course, how do you figure out how to stop the craving? And that's where his 8-fold path comes in. There's 8 parts to it, And that's what you've got to do. You've got to master all 8 of these things in order to get rid of your craving, which is leading to your suffering. And there's different ways making it visual. One of them is to just have, you know, like 8 spokes of a wheel. This would be a ship's wheel. They're all about having the right mind, the right view, the right intention, speech, concentration, effort, livelihood, and action. Everything's got to be right. And what does it mean to be right? They're each defined here. What we're looking for in Buddhism is moderation. All right? We don't want the extreme of hedonism. All right? That would be embracing your cravings, right? He said that's not going to get you anywhere. But we also don't want the self-denial of asceticism, because that doesn't get rid of the cravings. And again, a Christian would agree with those kinds of things, right? You can't get rid of your sinful nature just by saying that ignoring it. It doesn't work that way. So what's the right view? Well, in their estimation, it's karma, reincarnation, and those 4 noble truths. So you have to understand those. Secondly, you have to have peaceful renunciation. In other words, you need to let things go peacefully. You need to speak the truth and have kind words. You need to have pacifism, right? No killing, no violence, as well as sexual self-control. They wouldn't say you have to be, you have to give it up, but you have to have it under complete control. You have to do something for a living that is not a source of suffering in any way for you or for anyone else. So you couldn't be a drug dealer and follow the Eightfold Path, because then, of course, you're providing suffering to other people. You have to guard against sensual thoughts, which, of course, there's overlap between sexual self-control and that. You always have to be aware, no absent-mindedness. So there's a lot of this stuff is about getting your head in the right place, thinking properly, concentrating, all of that kind of stuff. Very, very much with the meditation, and that's, of course, the last one. So it's a whole bunch of stuff put together that's supposed to help you get under control those cravings, those desires that you don't need and are leading to your suffering. So where is Buddhism in the world today? As you see, in India, it's down to 0.8%. It's almost non-existent in India these days. But in Southeast Asia, you got 89% in Myanmar, 95% in Thailand, 95% in Cambodia, 60% in Laos, and then as you get, and way up in Mongolia, 90%. China's statistics are not on there because they're very difficult and we'll look at China in a minute, but 40% in Taiwan, 47% in South Korea. Basically all of Southeast Asia has a significant Buddhist population to one level or another. And there's a lot of overlap with some of the other religions and philosophies as well. It's not weird for a Buddhist to be a Buddhist and a Taoist, or a Buddhist and a Confucianist, or a Buddhist and someone who does Shinto. It's not weird for them to be 2 things. They don't have an issue with that. And we saw right there, 500 million people, 4th after Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. So very significant in terms of the demographics. What about the Dalai Lama? He's pretty famous. People have heard of him. Where does he fit in? Well, he is basically the leader of Tibetan Buddhism, of Buddhism in Tibet. That's a title, the Dalai Lama. It's not a name, it's a title that began in 1578. They believe that each new Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of the embodiment of compassion, all right? That he's being reborn as a new person time and time again. The current one, Tenzin Gyatso, the Chinese government's not a fan. You might have heard of this. The communist Chinese government does not like him at all because he represents and talks about Tibetan independence, and that's a big no-no for the government of China. When he dies, the Chinese government has said they have the right to select the next Dalai Lama. Well, the Tibetan Buddhists will never accept someone selected by the Chinese government, and the Chinese government's not going to let them select someone of their own. So there's going to be probably an impasse that he may be the last Dalai Lama until the Chinese Communist government ceases to exist. And who knows when that might happen. So what about Christianity and Buddhism? What's the history there? It's an interesting one. We have a long history of what we call syncretism, which is the idea of blending two things together. All right? In the East, so in India and Southeast Asia, there's a long history between the Nestorian Christians. Most of a good segment of Eastern Christianity, and this is a whole different topic, was Nestorian, which is a heresy that said that there are two Jesuses. There's the Word of God and there's the human. They're kind of like two separate people. It's one you probably haven't heard much of because it's not in the West. But along the Silk Road, you guys have heard of the Silk Road, right? Marco Polo, that trade route that led to China, along that route, there was a lot of that combination of that Eastern Christianity with Buddhism for centuries. Into the Middle Ages. There's a Chinese 7th century manuscript talking about Jesus that is a real blend of Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity, kind of just jumbling them all together and making them one. So there's a long history in Southeast Asia of just kind of putting them together and saying, we could have both. So what gets in the way when a Christian is trying to explain the gospel to a Buddhist? Obviously, along with Hinduism, you've got this whole idea of karma and reincarnation, right? And that's going to, of course, the same way, get in the way because it stops people from worrying about this life. And it also has people thinking that, well, I'm happy and wealthy, so I must be on a good path. Why would I be worried, right? I get good karma. A different aspect from Hinduism is that basically God is irrelevant in Buddhism. You come in and you start talking about God to a Buddhist and he's like, why are you talking to me about God? Right? Who cares about God? What's God got to do with it? Of course, Buddhists are the epitome of self-reliance, right? The original Buddha basically sat under a tree until he figured it all out. It was all up to him. All right? Nobody helped him. Nobody did it for him. It's all self-reliant. There's no concept in Buddhism of someone saving you. All right, it's all you got to do it for yourself. Of course, that's going to be a barrier. And once again, we're dealing with karma. So you start talking about undeserved grace, you start talking about forgiveness, you lost them, right? Because they believe that everybody gets what's deserved, good or bad. And of course, the idea that there's no absolute truth. So you can tell a Buddhist, no, this is true and this is and you've got to listen to this, but they'd be like, well, you know, that's your truth, this is my truth, that's our truth, truth is truth. They're not worried about absolute truth. So it's a difficult conversation between a Christian and a Buddhist, same as it would be between a Muslim and a Buddhist or a Jew and a Buddhist, because these things are going to be hard to communicate across that barrier. So that's Buddhism, and Buddhism is connected to all of these things. It's all of these Eastern religions. There's a little bit of Buddhism in a lot of these other ones that we're going to be talking about as well. The next is Confucianism. Confucianism is, depending on who you ask, it's either a school of thought, a way of life, or it's a religion. So there's not agreement on that necessarily. Began with the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, and there you have his dates, 551 to 479 BC. So in the same basic time period as Buddhism, although this of course is in China. He wrote, or were written about in the 5 classics, and it's all about family and social harmony. All right, it's not really about spiritual things at all. The primary focus of Confucius thought is the humanistic ideas of the ideal society, right? What the ethics of an ideal society ought to be. It's very much related to Taoism and Buddhism. Again, a lot of overlap. You talk to somebody from the Far East, they may be a Confucius Taoist Buddhist in some combination, in some permutation of that. There's a lot of overlap. So what do they think about God? Well, it's not a religion per se, but it does contain Chinese folk religion. It's got that element of panentheism. We are all in God, all is God, that kind of stuff. He said you should respect the gods of your ancestors. You should do the proper rites. So it's basically just saying all the stuff of Chinese folk religion, the ancient Chinese religions, just go ahead and do that, right? Because we're respecting your family, we're respecting your ancestors. It's not a big deal, it's not the centerpiece, but you should do it anyway. They believe in something called Tien, which is an equivalent of heaven, which is related to Tao, but it's impersonal. It's not. There's no talk about personal God in that sense. So what do they think about humanity and ethics? Now this is the key. It rests upon a fundamental assumption that humanity is good, that we can be perfectible. And this reminds me very much of Plato's Republic, if you remember reading Plato's Republic in high school. All right? Plato basically said education is the key to perfecting humanity. If we get kids early, we teach them right from wrong, show them why it's right, they will choose it, because why wouldn't they? It's the right thing. It's very positive, very optimistic, very glass is half full. But unfortunately, that's not true. But the focus of Confucianism is thus virtue, ethics. We got to cultivate them in people. We're not worried about things like forgiveness and reconciliation with God and any of that kind of stuff, because people are fine. All right? These are the 4 virtues that they talk about. You got benevolence and compassion. You got upholding righteousness, norms and propriety, a lot of that stuff. What are the cultural norms? What is proper? All right? And then, of course, you need to develop the ability to see what is right and what is fair. It's all ethics. All right? It's basically an ethics course, and which is why some people don't consider it to be a religion. One of their biggest focuses is filial piety. It's doing the right thing by your family. It means a lot. A strong emphasis on being loyal to your family and your obligations to them. As a son, what is your obligation to your parents? As a daughter, what is your obligation to your children? You know, whatever. What are your obligations? What should you do for your family? Very much so. And caring for your parents is a big deal. Now, fast forward to the modern era. Post-World War II, the Chinese government imposed their one-child policy, right? You're familiar with that. You can only have one. In Confucian thought, the son is responsible for taking care of his parents, not the daughter. The daughter has to help take care of her in-laws. So if you are a Chinese peasant and your first child is a daughter, that's a big problem. Which is why there's a great imbalance in China, male to female. Nature makes it 51-49 at most, right? It's always close. It's off by about 5% in China today because of the millions of aborted girls and even some infanticide, right? Because they say, we can't have a daughter. Who's going to take care of us in our old age? We can only have one. The government said we can't have a second one. It's a big issue. Filial piety is the key virtue in Chinese culture, very similar to Japanese culture, when we're going to get to that in a minute. And so a lot of their stories focus on kids and people doing the right thing by their family. That's the moral of the story. Their version of things like Hansel and Gretel and all of that are all about people doing the right thing by their family. They've even got a collection of stories called the 24 Filial Exemplars, the 24 people that just did the right thing by their family. It's all about family. And you probably would understand, if you knew people that are steeped in Chinese culture, you would definitely see that. One of the interesting things about Confucianism is how much influence it had on the government of China. Which is a bit unusual. It was the basis of the imperial exams. The Song dynasty said, if you want to work in our government, you need to pass a Confucius-based entrance exam. It was not about who your parents were. It was not about anything other than your ability on this exam, which we call meritocracy, right? Your score means you get in. If you want to be a government official, you need to pass a test. Kind of like the civil servants test that our government uses, only probably with a lot more philosophy in it, a lot more ethics. That's really all it was about whether or not you understood Confucian thought. And until 1905, that was how you got a government job. So it had a huge influence for 1,000 years on different governments in China, at least in the bureaucracy, not necessarily the emperor, but the people running the thing. So what about Confucianism today? There is a huge estimate variance here. We've got estimates from 10 million to 350 million. You say, how could it be that broad? Well, it all depends on your definition. All right? Are you asking for just the people that follow Confucian philosophy? Or are you also including the hundreds of millions of Chinese who have some Confucian thought along with Chinese cultural, ancient, Chinese religions? The ancient ones. Are they holding on to those things? That folk religion. Because a lot of people in China still practice Chinese folk religion, along with their Confucian attitudes and behaviors and thoughts. They may not spend a lot of time, considering the Confucian part of it, but it's definitely ingrained in the way they act and what they do. And almost all of the people that would be under that banner are either Chinese or they're Taiwanese or Korean or Vietnamese. They've got that Chinese cultural influence. There's not much beyond those borders in the world today. So what's the history with Christianity? Two viewpoints. The first one is the previous. In the 16th century, you got Jesuit missionaries. They come to China and they learn about Confucianism and they say, oh, this is ethics. We can work with this. We like the ethics, right? Being right by your family, doing the right thing. There's no problem with that. And they said, sure, just put Christianity on top of that, keep Confucianism, and we got no issue. They didn't have a problem with it. When the Dominicans and the Franciscans came in the 18th century, they took a look at it and said, whoa, 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 you're missing something. There's Chinese folk religion underneath this. That's idolatry. And so they said, no, you can't be Confucius and Christian. And so two different, Christian missionaries, about 2 centuries apart, had a very different reaction to their understanding of this. One said it was a religion, one said it was a philosophy. As a philosophy, there's not a lot that a Christian would say I got a problem with. As a religion, of course, if you're talking about ancestor worship and idols and all that stuff, then Christians are going to say, no, we can't have that. So that's an open-ended question. Whether or not there's that issue depends on whether or not you see it as a philosophy or a religion. Well, what's going to get in between a Christian and a Confucius when you're talking about the gospel? Well, that first question is right there. Is this just a philosophy that you can work with, or is it a religion that you need to, that they need to overcome? That's a big question. Secondly, it's completely intertwined with Chinese culture. If you are a Chinese person and someone is asking you to accept Christianity, it almost feels to you like they're asking you to give up being Chinese. And that's no small shakes, right? That's a hard thing to deal with. How can you become a Chinese Christian without letting go your cultural heritage? Because it's so intertwined with Confucian thought and that folk religion. Of course, there is a false premise that a Christian is going to talk about when they talk to Confucius, because the Confucius believes that humanity is inherently good, where Christianity says no, and humanity is inherently flawed. We've got problems, we need help. Whereas the Confucius is like, no, we're okay, we can fix this. And so there's a thing. Now, Confucius talked about heaven, but he didn't talk about God. He didn't talk about salvation because he didn't think we needed it. We were fine. It was all about doing the right thing. Nobody in Confucianism is looking for salvation. So you're not talking about the same stuff. So there's some barriers there that need to be overcome. And a lot of that depends on whether or not you're dealing with someone who just is accepting the philosophy, or someone who is also dealing with the Chinese folk religion as well. It's a bit complicated. All of these Eastern religions are complicated when it comes to talking about the gospel with someone, because you're not, you might be passing like ships in the night. You think you're talking about something, and you think they understand, but you don't understand each other at all. And that's always a concern. The next one is Taoism, and you might also know it as Taoism. Very similar. I'm sure you're familiar with the yin-yang symbol. That's a lot of people have that tattoo. They have no idea what it means, but they think it looks cool. Or you might have seen it in art or on t-shirts or whatever. So what is Taoism? And we're going to have a lot of overlap here, because Taoism is also a religion/philosophy in Chinese culture. So there is a tremendous amount of overlap between Confucianism and Taoism. They're not the same, but they're very similar, and they come from the same place. It's all about living in harmony with the Tao. And a definition of the Tao is not an easy thing to come by. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute. I'll do my best, but just defining it is hard. It has a founder, a man named Lao Tzu, said to have written the Tao Te Ching in 4th century BC. So we've got Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism all founded in that same period, right? That 6th to 4th century BC, all in the East. They have a very similar background in that respect. It's not going to emphasize the ritual of Confucianism. Confucianism would say, practice your local ancestral rituals, right? Honor your ancestors. Whereas Taoism is not going to focus on that very much. And it's also not going to say that the goal is social stability and social harmony. All right? That's not what they're worried about. So what is the Tao? It literally in Chinese means the way. But that probably doesn't help you too much either, right? You could call it the road, the channel, the path, the doctrine, the line. I think it's best for us if we think of it as the path, or even better, the channel makes you feel like a river that's got to flow the way the channel goes, right? There's a lot about flowing the proper way in this, so maybe that's the best one for us. And it's all about intuitively knowing what the right way to go is. You can't grasp it, you just know it. It's one of those things where it's hard to explain to someone else when it's something that you're talking about. I just know it, right? Have you ever had one of those kind of conversations where you're trying to explain something and you end up saying, I just know it? And that probably didn't help the person that was asking you. Children ask questions like that all the time, right? They usually, it's like, why? And what do we usually say? Because I said so, right? You didn't quite explain it to them, but sometimes that's all you can do. So what are they worried about? The cyclical pattern of nature. That's what Tao is. Tao is not God. Taoists don't worship the Tao. They talk about the Tao. They don't worship the Tao. It's all about nature and the natural thing. All right, and so a lot of this has to deal, it's kind of like karma and dharma together, right? Karma is action and reaction. Dharma is the right thing, everything having its own purpose. And so Taoism is basically conforming to the purpose that you have, all right? And going with that flow. Accepting, conforming to, working with the natural developments, all right? So instead of fighting against life, you're kind of accepting it and going with it and sort of blending it and shaping it. There's actually Chinese martial arts that takes that whole attitude, that you're not trying to stop a punch, you're trying to redirect it. Right? You might have, and we're not going to go too deep into Chinese martial arts because we'll lose most people. Only a couple of us care about such things. But you might have seen that explanation in some martial arts movie, which is really what they're talking about here. So what's the primary ethical concept in Taoism? It's called Wu Wei, and it's all about effortlessness and harmony. Right? You're trying to be like water and flow. Right? Water takes the path of least resistance, right? And here's my example. I didn't mean it this way, but here it is. Water conforms to this vessel that I put it in, right? It took the shape of what I put it in. Rather than trying to change it, it conformed to it. And that's kind of the essence of what we're talking about here, is conforming to the circumstances. Rather than trying to change them, you're molding them and shaping them and working with them. All right. What are their three focuses there? Compassion, moderation, humility. There's a lot of fasting, a lot of vegetarianism. We're not going to get. The Taoist is not going to get involved in those political arguments. The Confucius are always about this is the right kind of government, this is the right kind of society. The Taoist is going to be kind of like live and let live. All right, so a lot of the people from the 60s that were all just kind of like, man, can't we just live and, can't we all live in harmony? they were being Taoists probably without even knowing it. Whether they understood that or not, that was a very Taoist kind of thing. The idea just to go with the flow. So what do they think about God? It's pantheistic, which means everything is God. There is no deity. There's no supreme being. We're all part of God. Everything is God. There is, which is kind of weird when they said there's no supreme being, because there's also a pantheon and deities might be the wrong word, of sort of like immortals, kind of like heroes that emanate from the Tao. I'm not sure what that exactly means, but I read about it, I was like, okay. And so there is no God, but there are some immortal beings, but they're not God, so don't think of them like God, which is why I try to say that. That was probably more confusing than it had to be, but that's what it is, so we got to go with it. And of course the yin-yang, all right? They believe in what we call eternal dualism. They believe that the universe is divided into light and dark, good and evil, hot and cold. Everything is in an eternal balance, which is what that yin-yang is supposed to represent. As one grows, the other goes the other way, right? You can't get rid of them. They're eternally balanced. There is some of that in Western thought as well. If you look at the writings of the Apostle John in his letters, in 1 John in particular, he's going against the Gnostics, and the Gnostics believed in dualism, in the idea of an eternal good and an eternal evil, which is obviously not a Christian idea, not a Jewish or Muslim idea either, because all three of those would say, no, 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 the ultimate reality is God, and ultimately the end of existence will be just light. Whatever is evil will be done away with. Whatever is dark will be removed. Whereas the Taoist would never believe that you can change that balance. It's eternal. It's always been that way. And so we as human beings reflect that. We've got the good and evil in us. We've got the light and the dark in some kind of balance. They would accept that as being natural. And when we die, we go back to the Tao, whatever that means. It's not really a separate afterlife. We just, because it's all pantheism, we are all part of God. When we cease to live, we just go back to being part of God again, in whatever form that takes. So, one thing that you might be familiar with from Taoism, that comes from Taoism, you might not know that's where it comes from, is feng shui. It is basically an interesting way to do architecture. How to arrange the furniture in your room, how to arrange the buildings so that you are going with the flow, right? So that you're not working against the natural order of things. If you're a fan of one of those shows like Property Brothers or whatever, I remember an episode where they dealt with someone who wanted to buy a house that had good feng shui. And so they were trying to explain, no, the doors are supposed to be like this, and then this is supposed to be like that. There's a whole system. If you are a big fan of architecture, I guess you could get into it. Not everybody is, so we'll let it go at that. Taoism today, and this map totally didn't turn out, but it works anyway, because there's China. And it's pretty much just China. About 175 million of the Chinese people, so about 13%, would be considered Taoists. And about a third of the Taiwanese. Of course, the Taiwanese are also Chinese, depending on who you ask, and that's a tough question, but ethnically they are Chinese as well, and culturally. So it's, again, like Confucianism, it's primarily relegated to China. It's got a lot of overlap with Confucianism, and there are going to be plenty of people that take their ethics, you know, and their governmental philosophy from Confucianism. They take their attitude about going with the flow and working with that from Taoism, and they kind of blend them together, maybe some Buddhism thrown in as well, and that's what you have. Like Confucianism, Taoism is considered by some to be a religion and some to be a philosophy, because remember, they're not dealing with the spiritual all that much. And like Confucianism, it's completely intertwined with Chinese culture and Chinese folk religion. It's hard to separate that out for anyone. And so you're going to have some of the same barriers. Again, we've got no personal God. right? There is no creator, there is no judge. So talking to someone about their creator, they're looking at you like, what are you talking about? They don't believe in a creator. Like Buddhism and Confucianism, Taoism says you don't need to be saved, you don't need to be rescued, you just need to be enlightened. It's all about understanding, it's all, the knowledge is the key. And then you've got that inherent dualism, the idea that the universe is eternally locked in good and evil equally balanced. All right? And so if you're talking about eradicating, in Christian terms, eradicating a sinful nature and developing the fruit of the Spirit and all that stuff, you're going down a path that they're not going to understand, because they're talking about balance. And they're not trying to eradicate a balance that they think is eternal. Okay, changing gears slightly. Shintoism. There's going to be some similar stuff, but Shinto's got some unique things to it that's going to set it apart from Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. Shinto is the traditional religion of Japan. It's been around a long time, but it was first recorded and codified in the 8th century. So you can't really get records of it beyond the 8th century AD, but it existed before then. And it developed from Chinese folk religion, just like those other ones developed from, from Japanese folk religion, just like Taoism and Confucianism developed from Chinese folk religion, just like Hinduism developed from Indian folk religion, right? They developed from the pre-existing religions of the people. What does Shinto mean? It means the way of the gods, which is a very interesting, nifty term. And it all focuses on, it all revolves around public shrines. It's interesting in that the vast majority of this religion are about public shrines. All right, you go to the shrines to do the rituals, and at the rituals you are appealing to the kami, which are, depending on how you want to define it, they're either the spirits or they're the gods. And a lot of this has to do with the spirits of your ancestors as well. From the 6th to the 19th century, Buddhism and Shinto were very much intertwined. Buddhism is still quite strong in Japan, but they blended the two together. They took some Buddhist stuff, some Shinto stuff, put it together. But during the Meiji Restoration, the government of Japan said, we got to get rid of that foreign, right, that foreign influence, that Chinese influence. They weren't exactly getting along with the Chinese at the time, as if they haven't very much at all in history. And so they tried to get rid of all that foreign stuff and tried to get rid of Buddhism. So what do they say about gods? Well, they talk about the kami, and that's the divinity, the sacred essence that's in everybody. But it's not just in people, it's in all living things, and even in inanimate objects. Everything has a kami, has a spirit. In former times, people called this kind of religion animism. That might be a name that you're more familiar with. It's kind of not in vogue anymore to use the term animism. I guess it's considered derogatory by some, but I put it there just because you might know that word already. So specific places then are where there are the focus for these kami. And so you build a shrine around a spot that has a really strong connection to the kami, to the spirits. All right? And so that's where people come to interact with the spirits, at that shrine that was chosen because it was a good spot. I don't know who decided, way back in the day, right? Because this comes from Japanese folk religion. So these particular spots already existed as Shinto developed, where people came for this kind of thing. And I am in no way going to try to pronounce this, because that's too many. But he's the heavenly ancestral God of the originating heart of the universe. No wonder it's a big word. That's a lot. He was supposed to be the first, and I'm sorry saying he, and it's probably not a bit gender-based, but anyway, the first kami who came into being alone. He's the only one that self-created, and then he's the one that created the universe. But you're not going to deal with that in terms of the same way that a Christian would talk about God as being the sole creator. But they believe that the Japanese archipelago, the Japanese islands, were created by the kami. by the gods. It was the home, you know, the one place that they created, which is exactly what the Greeks thought about Greece, right? The gods made this land, it's so awesome. The Egyptians thought that about the Nile. The Babylonians thought that about the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's fairly common. Our land is such a beautiful and blessed place. It's the one place the gods created. Not everybody says that, because not everybody likes where they came from, but most cultures have that. And so what are they going to focus on? What are they going to talk about? It's all about impurity, all right? It's not about right and wrong per se, about good and evil. It's about impurity. When you do something wrong, something unethical, you get impurity in yourself. And the only way to get rid of that are through purification rituals. They're called hare. They are the vital part of Shinto. There's daily, weekly, seasonal, lunar, and annual hare to be done at the shrines. So you go to the shrine on a regular basis to perform the ritual that gets rid of the impurity that you have attached to yourself by doing something wrong. You get me? You with it? All right. It's all about doing the ritual to appeal to the kami, because you did some wrong stuff. The ethical emphasis is on serenity, honesty, and purity. All right, which seems very, very similar to what we were talking about Confucianism and Taoism as well. It's very reserved, very, very contemplative. But when you're talking to someone who believes in Shintoism, you're not really talking about right versus wrong so much as you are talking about getting rid of impurity. That's going to be an idea that we're going to talk about in our last one when we talk about Scientology. They've got that very Shinto idea about impurity and needing to get rid of it, which is an interesting connection. Here's where they differ from Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. All right, all the rest of those believe in reincarnation. Shintoism does not. So if you're talking to someone who is Japanese, who believes in Shinto, they don't believe in reincarnation. All the other Eastern religions and philosophies do, but not Shinto. The dead join that spiritual realm, and your kami goes and joins that when you die. All right, so your ancestors are part of the kami that you are ritually worshiping, might not quite be the right word, but which you are doing rituals to. And so there are, if you've heard about this, it's always in the news, there's a shrine in Japan that is to the dead from World War II. Right, to those who died during World War II. And there's always a big controversy when the Japanese emperor goes to that shrine to pay respects to the Japanese that died during World War II. All right, the Chinese government's not a big fan of that display because they weren't a big fan of what the Japanese army did during World War II, right? Neither are the Koreans happy with that, and some Americans as well, because you're saying that the emperor is honoring those soldiers. And it would be like it would be similar to what's her name in Germany, Andrea Merkel, if she went to a shrine in Berlin to the Nazi dead, don't you think that the Poles would be a little upset about that, and Israel would be upset about that, and the Russians? And so that keeps happening on a regular basis in Japan. It's a big controversy, and you might have read about it before, maybe not, but because they believe that your ancestors are part of that kami, and you've got to ritually fulfill your duties, right? You can't ignore that, and so asking them to not do that, they're not gonna. All right, it would be completely against their entire belief system to say that they can't go to that shrine. But there's a lot of symbolism when the emperor does it. So they don't believe in reincarnation. They believe that your spirits go and join the rest of them afterwards. So there's a lot of what we would call ancestor worship involved in this. So what about Christianity and Shinto? When the Jesuit missionaries arrived in 1549, and Francis Xavier was with them as well, they had a lot of success in the 1570s. There were 100,000 Japanese Christians in the 1570s. It was a sizable minority in Japan, the Christians were, and growing. So by 1597, the government said, we can't have that. All right, they're going too fast. We got to get rid of this. And there were a lot of reasons beyond that, but that was the primary issue, is that they were worried about that growth. And so they started persecuting them. And there was just that movie that came out last year that was about the missionaries and dealing with that persecution. They crucified a good number of them. They killed them. They drove the church in Japan underground. And they kept it up for multiple generations, to the extent that by 1873, when freedom of religion was proclaimed and Protestant missionaries came back to Japan, there was virtually no church for them to find. All right, now of course that's 200, almost 300 years of official persecution. That's generation after generation after generation of being outlawed, and there being absolutely no way to publicly acknowledge Christianity or witness or have, you know, Bibles or any of that. So it's no surprise that they were virtually snuffed out. When the missionaries came in 1873, they had very little success in Japan. The first time, people accepted it willingly. The second time, not so much. Korea, on the other hand, as you may know, is a majority, at least South Korea, a majority Christian country. That when they came there, people were very much willing to accept it. So they had very different reaction. There's only about 2% of the people in Japan that are Christians today. So it is a sizable, a small minority there today. Whereas in the 1500s, it was on the way to becoming a significant number. So there's some animosity in that history. So Shintoism in Japan today, about 80% of the people in Japan, to one extent or another, practice Shinto. So almost everybody is going to go to the shrine and honor their ancestors and participate in the rituals. Whether they are like true believers or not, they're going to go through the motions. They're going to do the stuff because it's part of your culture, it's part of honoring your family. They wouldn't go against that. But as you can see, 65% of the people also practice some Buddhist things. There's a ton of overlap there. These charts try to show you where they're popular, but they're basically showing you that they're both everywhere. All right? You've got a lot of Buddhism, a lot of Shinto in Japan, and almost nothing else. So what are the barriers then to evangelism in Japan with Shinto? Well, number one, it's that religion is a secondary thing. It's not the first thing. It's not the most important thing at all. Family is. Your country, your livelihood, your family all come before your religion to someone who adheres to Shinto, to someone who is part of that Japanese culture. All right? So much so, it's all about conformity, honor, your ancestry. So if you go and you talk to a Japanese person who is living in Japan, of course it's much more difficult in Japan when you're part of the society, you're asking them to create a division in their family. Because if they walk away from Shinto, their family's not going to have any of that, right? They're not honoring their ancestors anymore. And that is a huge no-no. And so you're asking them to basically ostracize themselves from their entire family. And if you are culturally raised in the Japanese culture, it is a no-brainer to choose family over truth. They're not going to fault you at all for choosing family over truth. And we probably all know some family that are like that, right? Family's more important than truth. Even though my family are wrong, even though they're being idiots, I'm going to stick with my family no matter what, right? Some people are like that. The rest of you are like, oh, my family are morons, I'll let them go. But if you know someone who would stick to their family no matter how wrong their family are, then you probably understand Shinto a little bit. The culturally correct choice is to pick your family over religion. And so the Japanese people, because of that minute minority in Japan, they have very little understanding of Christianity. You don't have a lot of common things you can talk about because they don't know what you're talking about. You're starting from scratch. They don't have a lot of interaction. The Chinese people have a lot more. The Indian people have a lot more interaction in their history and in their culture with Christianity than the Japanese do, than Shinto does. So you got a long way to go to just get started. But once you do, if someone's intrigued by the ideas of Christianity, they're going to say, yeah, but this is about my family. And they've been raised that family is first no matter what. Our last one, and we are in good shape. I am flying, so we will have some time at the end for questions. He says, prophetically, not knowing how long this one will take. All right, so we've come all the way back around, globally speaking, and we're back in the United States. But I put Scientology last because I think you're going to see a lot of thought that is Buddhist, that is Taoist, that is Shinto. You're going to see some stuff in here and say, hey, they got that from those Eastern religions, didn't they? You'll say, yes, yes, he did. Or that would be L. Ron Hubbard. There's their headquarters. L. Ron Hubbard, you've probably heard of him in connection with Scientology. Before we start, so you don't get confused, it is not Christian Scientists. They are not Scientologists. You got the word science in both, but it's not the same thing. The Church of Christ Scientists were founded by Mary Baker Eddy in the 19th century. We didn't talk about them when I talked about the other restorationist 19th century ones because they're the smallest of them by far. There's only about 100,000 Christian Scientists in the United States. So I didn't talk about them when we talked about Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, and Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're in that same mold in terms of being modern, restorationist, talking about the end times and all that stuff. But the one thing that everybody knows about the Church of Christ Scientist is that they won't go to a doctor. They refuse medical care no matter what, and they get in trouble with the government all the time, right? When a child dies from the common flu because they wouldn't take them, they wouldn't give them any medicine, any of that kind of thing. That is their one thing that sticks out. But it is a very, very small group in that respect. Demographically, 100,000 is not a lot of people. So that's why I didn't give them their whole section. But don't confuse them with the Scientologist or you will be utterly confused. Moving on. So what is Scientology? It is a religious system or a belief or a practice. Once again, not everybody's sure whether or not it's a philosophy or a religion. Founded by American author L. Ron Hubbard in 1954. You can't get much more modern than starting in 1954. It's post-World War II. It's postmodern. It came out of Hubbard's counseling system. He was a counselor. He developed a system for counseling people that he called Dianetics, which you might have heard that term. And he calls Scientology he says that Scientology means knowing about knowing, or the science of knowledge. There's a lot of quotes in this one because I want to use his own words because it's difficult to understand. So it's knowing about knowing, which actually there is a fancy term for knowing about knowing. It's called epistemology. How we know what we know. It's a branch of philosophy. Guys like René Descartes, right? Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, believed that it was all about our thinking versus, I was a philosophy minor. I got that stuff in my head somewhere. Versus the empiricist who said that the essence of life is how you perceive it. Well, he's talking about knowing. So he has some influence. He probably had a philosophy class in college that really spoke to him. So what do they say about God? All right, I'll do my best. In Scientology, the concept of God is expressed as the eighth dynamic. It's the urge towards infinity, whatever that means. It's going towards infinity is how they talk about God. And part of the problem with explaining Scientology is because a lot of the deeper stuff of Scientology is reserved for people that are in Scientology. So you're only going to get information from ex-Scientologists, and that's always a dangerous place to get it from. So they call that the Supreme Being, the eighth dynamic. The Scientology concept of God rests at the very apex of universal survival. I just write the stuff down that they wrote. I don't claim to understand exactly what he means by that. It's hard to wrap your head around. So you have to get to the seventh dynamic in order to come to understand the eighth dynamic. And then you can understand the Supreme Being. So you can't know about God or the Supreme Being until you get to their last step. So you got to go all through the steps to get to number 8 before you can understand about God. So so basically it's not for groups like us that haven't gotten that far. Because you're just on step whatever, because we haven't even started. So they reject the idea of dogma, the idea of saying this is the truth and it's for everybody and let me tell you what it is. They would reject that. You have to figure it out on your own. You're supposed to discover the truth yourself. So asking a Scientologist to explain the truth to you is probably barking up the wrong tree, because you're supposed to figure out these things on your own. It's very similar to a self-help book in that sense. You're kind of given some guidelines and then said, okay, make some progress on your own. What about humanity? The fundamental truths of L. Ron Hubbard is that man is an immortal spiritual being. All right, okay. His experience extends well beyond a single lifetime. So he has the idea of reincarnation from the Eastern religions. It's not just one lifetime. Here's one that they don't say necessarily. Your capabilities are unlimited. So as a human being, you are immortal and your abilities are limitless. You just don't know it yet. You just haven't figured it out yet. And once again, they're saying that humanity is basically good. So you've got some of that idea of Confucianism there as well, that humanity is fine on our own. Obviously, if our abilities are unlimited, we'd have to be pretty much okay as it is, right? Otherwise, we would bump into limits. Let me do my best. I tried to narrow this stuff down, but I couldn't do it. So there's two major divisions in your mind. You've got your reactive mind that records your pain and all your emotional trauma in life. So you got a piece of your mind that keeps all that bad stuff that happened to you. All right? There's half of your mind. And then you've got your analytical mind, which is where all your consciousness is. So basically, in a nutshell, what Scientology is dealing with are your repressed traumas. The stuff that traumatized you that you don't know about. Because it's not in your active mind. It's not in your analytical mind for you to think about and talk about. It's the stuff that happened to you. All right? There's a little bit of this in psychology, right? Psychologists sometimes talk to people about repressed trauma, especially if, say, a child was molested or abused. They might repress that because they can't deal with it. And then later on in life, as a teenager, it starts coming back. They get the nightmares, they're acting out because of that trauma. There's some of that from psychology. Now, Scientology is famous for hating psychology and psychiatry, and we'll talk about that. But it's probably because they're so close to it, all right? Kind of like the people that annoy you the most are your siblings, because nobody in life is as similar to you as they are. So that's why you can't stand them, maybe. If you don't like them. If you love your siblings, ignore that. So, your reactive mind is storing the things that your analytical mind doesn't have available to you. And those are your engrams. He made that word up. Your engrams are the stuff in your mind from your trauma that's there. You don't know it's there, you're not aware of it, but it's in there because you've been traumatized in life. They're painful, they're debilitating, and they build up, right? Which makes sense, right? As life goes on, things build up. You know, you can't hold on to your anger or your disappointment or whatever and just keep holding on to it. That would be unhealthy. And it pushes you further and further away from what you're supposed to be. So what you need to do as a Scientologist is to get rid of those traumas, to get rid of that pain, that anxiety, that fear, that stuff that is in that part of your mind that inactive part of inactive might be the wrong word, the non-analytical part of your mind. Okay? How do you do that? How do you get rid of that past trauma? And here's where it comes in. The ultimate goal of Scientology is enlightenment and freedom for all. Well, how are we going to do that? It's up to you. You must save yourself. You must attain brotherhood with the universe. Alrighty, I'm going to get on that. But that feels very Buddhist, doesn't it? Right? Becoming one with the universe, understanding, enlightenment. We've got very Eastern thoughts here. Similar to Buddhism, the goal of Scientology is to end reincarnation. You've got to reject material reality and recognize that only the Thaytan truly exists. We haven't defined that yet. But, so that's a lot like the Buddhist idea of nirvana, right? The goal is to cease to exist. The goal is to stop the suffering, right? We've basically got Buddhism and modern American psychology together in Scientology. Whether or not a Scientologist would appreciate that, I think that's a fair assessment. There are secret mystical teachings that are only available to members at the higher levels. So what the real deep things of Scientology are, I can't tell you, because nobody's supposed to know. Only the people at the 7th level can know what they are. It's like one of those secret handshake societies that you can't know what kind of thing. Which brings you to auditing. That's their big thing, auditing. In Dianetics, remember that's his psychology, an auditor, which is a counselor, helps a person clear. You might have heard the term clear in terms of Scientology. That's a big thing, which basically means that you're emptying your recycle bin. Let me use a computer thing, right? You put stuff, you delete it, put it in the recycle bin, but it builds up. Every once in a while, you got to empty the recycle bin, right? At least back in the day on the old computers when you didn't have any real memory to work with, you needed to. You couldn't just let it build up. Now, when you got gigs and all over the place, who cares? But the whole idea is you've got to get rid of that past trauma. You need to clear it, all right? You need to work through it and get rid of it. Now, that's not an idea foreign to psychiatry. All right? There are psychologists and psychiatrists who do that. That's their kind of counseling, is to help people deal with their past trauma, work their way through it, and get rid of it. All right? Their version of it is called auditing, and you're supposed to clear. Hubbard introduced the concept of the Thaytan, your soul, because some of his auditors, some of his people were reporting that they had past life experiences in their counseling process. And so Hubbard said, oh, it must be that we're immortal, it must be that our soul has always existed. And so he started talking about the Thaytan. The goal of auditing is what they call the clear state, which is freedom from your engrams, freedom from your traumas. So you've got to clear those things out, you've got to get rid of them so that you can be what you were supposed to be and attain your limitless potential. If that sounds like something that you would hear at the Best Western by the airport from the guy that's speaking and came, kind of like that, right? It's all self-help guru, it's all fix it yourself, it's all that. But in order to do auditing, you need an e-meter, and that's what that thing is here. It is not a scientific instrument of any kind. It's some kind of electrical thing that has a bunch of gadgets and whatnot that you have to pay for as a Scientologist. There's a whole bunch of this that has to do with them making a whole lot of money. And I don't think that's unfair at all. So you take the e-meter and you hold on to that, and the counselor, as you're talking about your traumas, will be reading the gauges, and then that somehow helps you clear. Yeah, that's what it is. So it is a rejection of psychology. Hubbard tried to get his theory, his Dianetics, accepted by the psychiatric community. They rejected him. They said, this is pseudoscience, this isn't real, sorry, no. And after that, he has trashed psychology and psychiatry. I mean, trashed it. Official Scientologist position is that those two professions are basically their version of the devil, right? They're horrible, they're ruining people, so they're totally against psychology and psychiatry. If you are a Scientologist, you will never go to one of them. That's for sure. And here's what he had to say about psychiatry. Psychiatry spawned the ideology which fired Hitler's mania, turning the Nazis into mass murderers and creating the Holocaust. I'm pretty sure, as someone who majored in history, that that's not what got the Nazis going. It was not psychiatry. It was nationalism, it was racism, it was a whole bunch of stuff, but it wasn't psychiatry. That's very weird. But that's what Hubbard feels about psychiatry, is that that led to the Nazis. So it's bad. The effects of medical and psychiatric drugs, whether painkillers, tranquilizers, antidepressants, he puts that in quote because he doesn't believe in it, are as disastrous as illegal drugs. So as a Scientologist, you're not taking Advil. You're not taking Xanax. You're not taking whatever, right? Because he believes that those things are as bad for you as cocaine and heroin. Alrighty. So they don't believe in antidepressants, and you've probably heard several of the Hollywood-related people railing against antidepressants or against psychiatry in general. They repeat the stuff of Hubbard in that way, very much so. So what's going on with Scientology in our world today? There's the world's most famous Scientologist, right? It's Tom Cruise. These days, anyway, he's more famous than some of the other ones, but right now, anyway, because his acting career is still going pretty good. You cannot get accurate statistics about Scientologists. They say that they have somewhere between 8 and 15 million members, depending on it. They have 8 million on the higher levels and 15 million kind of in the front door, just getting started. That's what they say. Those numbers are probably not even close to accurate. However, when there was a census done in 2006, the United States Census, they ask you about your religion. You don't have to tell them, of course, but they take that. That's one of the questions. There were only 25,000 Americans who said they were Scientologists. So either most Americans didn't tell the truth about that, or more than 8 million of them, or the Scientologists are pumping their numbers to try to sound like there's more, which is not new amongst some religious groups. All right, and one of the other things that you need to know about Scientology is that Hubbard has said that if you are a critic of Scientology, you are fair game, which means you can be destroyed, however they decide to go about that. You can be harassed, you can be punished in some way, whatever they need to do. If you are a vocal critic of Scientology, do not be surprised if they come at you hard on things like social media, or maybe even messing with your person. You might get assaulted. Because L. Ron Hubbard said, if you criticize us, we're coming after you, and we can ruin you. And they've been good on that threat for a lot of people, which is not very nice. So what is going to get between yourself and a Scientologist if, as a Christian, you're trying to share the gospel with them? Well, number one, Scientology is a self-help program. It says you don't need help from someone else. So you're trying to help someone who believes in a system that says they don't need your help. So they probably don't want your help because they're trying to fix their own problem, right? So that you got an issue there. They're not talking about repentance. They're not talking about depending on God. None of that stuff. It's you can do it yourself, right? L. Ron Hubbard said you are limitless. Your potential has no limits. You can do it. And the Christian says, no, you got to depend on God. Those are going in opposite directions. And of course, of all the ones that we talked about, Scientology has the most cult-like nature. If you were to define a cult, traditional definition, they're the closest to it in all of the details. The only ones that rival it would be the splinter groups within Mormonism that still practice polygamy. They're very cult-like, but they're the unofficial ones hiding out in the mountains kind of thing. And it is a big business. So they are very protective, very secretive, very much about removing people from their surroundings and bringing them into the Scientologist fold and not letting them out. So yeah, it is a definite issue. I would not personally accord them the respect of calling them a religion, because it's much more like a cult than anything else. But in terms of a sociologist or a anthropologist would, because they meet those criteria, of course, because they talk about spiritual things. So that's where we're at, and that's the last one. We've got a few minutes to go. Holy cow, I zoomed through that.
Could you back up a couple pictures?
I can back up a couple. Which, one more?
No, right there. Looks like he's got a cross-like symbol on his podium.
Yep, they use that one. They also use this one down here. That's their main symbol. And I tried to figure out what it meant, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me. So, but Scientology takes a little bit of that stuff, but it's definitely got no connection to Christianity. There's no talk about God. There's no talk about Jesus. None of that stuff. It's all self-help. And then, of course, most of it's secret. So hard to say what the upper levels are all about.
You can talk about after death.
They're not talking about, did I talk about? Yeah, they did, because the Scientologists believe that we're immortal, right? And that we've had past lives and we'll have more lives. So it's a lot like reincarnation in that respect. Again, in order to understand Scientology, take a good heaping helping of Eastern religion, right? Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, take some of that, combine it with self-help psychology, and you got Scientology. That's it in a nutshell.
So is Christian Science false religion
Christian Scientists, way back to these guys, are a group within Protestant Christianity. The rest of their stuff is not all that unusual. It's just this one right here about not seeking medical treatment. It's got no precedent in the history of the church. Nobody did that before. It's very odd. The only commonality would be with the refusal for the blood transfusions from the Seventh-day Adventists, which is a misinterpretation of a verse in Acts. But that's the one thing that makes them stand out. And since there's so few of them, I've never met a Christian Scientist. They've got their reading rooms. That's about the only thing most people ever heard, right? The Christian Science reading rooms and the Christian Science Monitor, their publication. That's about it that anyone's ever had any real interaction, mainly because, I mean, 100,000 people in the United States means there's not that many in Pennsylvania. So I wouldn't necessarily make that judgment against them, but that is a very weird thing and a very dangerous thing. For if nothing else, Christian Science is dangerous because it gets people killed. Children as much as any, and that's not a good thing. So I would try to speak out against it on that level and say simply, wait a minute, this is dangerous. Any religious movement within a religion that becomes dangerous, you gotta work against when it starts getting people killed or advocating violence or whatever. That's apart from all other considerations, a bad thing all by itself. So, yes.
Up here you have Mary Baker Eddy, as the founder in the 19th century, but then we're talking about L. Ron Howard.
No, that's Church of Christ Scientists. That's the one that Scientology is not, which is why I put it in there, just because the names are so similar, sometimes people get confused. And I even saw a publication, an actual book, that was using the two terms interchangeably. They were confused between Christian Scientists and Scientologists. When you use the word science like that, most people are just like, that must be the same thing, but it's not. So I would not I just want to make sure you understood that. There's L. Ron Hubbard. So he's also a science fiction writer, wrote some weird stuff. Battlefield Earth was based on one of his novels, one of the worst movies ever made.
He's still living.
No, he died. I didn't write the date on there for some reason. So, any other questions before we wrap it up? Big picture questions. Anything in that respect? There are other religions, of course. These were just 11 that I thought we would gain the most from learning about. There are a lot of other ones as well, and a lot of small ones too that don't have a big impact. But anything else?
What does folk mean?
So when I talked about folk religion a lot, folk just means, another word for that would be indigenous. The religion of the people, the ancient traditional kind of thing. Native American religion is considered to be a folk religion. It was what they've practiced locally, and it's very similar, right? Because Native American religion has a lot of variation in it, but it's got a lot of common. It's got that one commonality, right? There are a lot of talk about the Great Spirit and whatnot. There's some similarity in most of it, much like in Indian folk religion in the continent of India. That became Hinduism. It's very different from place to place, but it's got some common threads. Same thing in China, same thing in Japan. The only reason we're not talking about those in terms of Christianity is because Christianity replaced the folk religion of the Scandinavians, the Germans, the Greeks, and other. They replaced those religions. They didn't incorporate it. They replaced it. If you think about when the Christian missionaries first came to Scandinavia, right? The Vikings, Odin and Thor, and all of that stuff. After a couple of generations, that stuff slowly died away, and within a short span of time, historically speaking, nobody was following that anymore. Nobody was practicing it. It just had kind of ceased to exist. Whereas with Hinduism, with Confucianism and Shinto, they're still incorporating that ancient folk religion as part of their modern worship. Does that make sense? Does that differentiate it for you? About the only example of that I've seen with Christianity is that a little bit of that exists in Central and South America, where some of the Mayan and Aztec and Incan stuff has been somewhat incorporated into Catholicism. When the missionaries came, they tried to sort of divert the people from that religion and by renaming things and reusing things and whatnot. Yet some of that old stuff still persists a little bit, and of course it fades as time goes on. But there's a little bit of that blending there. But for the most part, Islam and Christianity in particular were like, no, we're replacing what you had before. You're not keeping any of it. And so there's not that blending. Does that make sense?
Thank you, yes.
Okay. Might have made that point clearer before. Maybe I'll add that point in at some point somewhere in the future. Yes?
So you were saying that with the Scientologists, that it was sort of hard for people to get out of the church.
Yes.
What happens whenever people try to get out of the church of Scientology?
Well, one of the things, of course, that's going to keep people from leaving Scientology is the financial commitment. You make a big financial commitment to be part of something. It's hard, like an investment, right? You put some money into a big investment, and then you put some more, and then you put some more. It's hard to say, I'm walking away, and I'm going to lose my whole investment. That's hard for people. But the other part, of course, is that if you leave Scientology and badmouth it, they'll come after you. They'll try to destroy you. In the sense, with the kind of harassment that we're used to seeing from teenagers online against each other, kind of thing. Can be quite brutal.
Well, there's a book actually. The girl that was in King of Queens, Leah.
Yeah.
She wrote a book about that.
There's quite a few horror stories
Troublemaker. And it was excellent. And she has a show on A&E that talks about, all.
It's not hard to find. You can find plenty of stuff of ex-Scientologists saying, whoa, that they tried to ruin me. And they're not the only ones that do that. I mean, other religions at times can be pretty mean to ex-members. But in the modern sense, that's one of the ones that stands out for that. About the only ones that don't get upset would be Judaism. You can walk away from Judaism and you're, other than culturally, you might have some relatives upset with you. Nobody's like yelling heretic, or anything like that. They just don't get upset about it. And of course, a Buddhist is not going to, right? He's going to be like, live, let live, do what you want. Your truth, my truth, it's okay. They're not going to get all that upset. Anything else? All right, well, I thank